Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen. This week, a very interesting conversation that I was looking forward to having with President Thomas Jefferson. We talked about the wall of separation between church and state, and as always, his insights into this are very valuable.
Jefferson felt so strongly about this. You know, he was not an atheist. He was a deist and a Unitarian. Yes, he edited the New Testament as a private meditation during his time as third president of the United States. He kept his personal religious views extremely close to the chest and refused point-blank questions about his actual religious sensibilities, partly because he believed that they were truly private and no one's business but his own. But he also knew how volatile questions of religion were in his time and still are. I mean, I think Jefferson would have a harder time being elected president today than in his own time, because it was clear to everyone. I mean, whatever else they thought, they might have thought he was an atheist, but everyone knew that he was a free thinker, that he had advanced views, that he was skeptical of the miracles, that he was an anti-Trinitarian, that he had some conflicts with religious leaders and so on, and that he had written this breathtaking law for Virginia, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and now had written the letter to the Danbury Baptists, which wasn't widely circulated in his time, but was known. And so everyone in the country knew Jefferson is an unusual man. He's not a standard issue Christian, and that he has some views that would be regarded in some quarters as controversial. So Jefferson was well aware of that, and he needed to protect his privacy because it would have damaged him severely if all that we now know about his religious views had been published in his time. Unlike John Adams, he didn't have to publish everything that passed through his heart or his mind. So it's a fascinating story. And I believe that he is absolutely right on this one, that when in doubt, throw it out. You know, that we have all these agonizing moments where there's a Ten Commandments on the courthouse lawn, and this winds up in the court system, and eventually the Ten Commandments have to go because they do violate the Establishment Clause. And David, people just don't understand the Establishment Clause. But here's an easy way to think about it. Let's say that there is a classroom of 100 students. If we pray to the Christian God at 8 a.m. in that classroom, let's say that of that 100-student body, 75 students are Lutherans and 20 are Catholics. So that prayer covers both of them probably without controversy. But what about the others? What about the Native American girl? What about the Muslim? What about the Jewish student? What about the Jehovah's Witness student? They're part of this mix too, and this is public space, publicly funded. And if you had a majoritarian Christian prayer, even if the great majority of the students were fine with it, it would amount to, quote, an establishment of religion, because it would say this is the religion of the country and Islam is not. This is the religion of the country and Jehovah's Witness is not. This is the religion of the country and Mormonism is not. And so that then becomes an establishment. And people say, well, what difference does it make? Let just 2 or 3 students. I mean, come on, it's clear that the majority of us are Christians. But that's what the Founding Fathers wanted to avoid. They wanted to protect these minorities, and not because they were liberals who loved minorities. They wanted to protect them because they knew that it's a slippery slope. The minute you go after a state church, then you're going to have deeper and deeper sectarian tension and violence. And so the founders were geniuses in this, and the genius of the geniuses was Thomas Jefferson. And so that letter that he wrote, with his felicitous capacity for prose, and on the first day of January 1802, is one of the most important letters in American history. And it so beautifully encapsulates the meaning of the First Amendment my fear, and I know your fear, is that that wall is being chipped away at and is in danger of being demolished in our time. And I believe that I will live to see a reversal of the school prayer decision of the early 1960s.
Oh boy, I hope you're wrong on that. Anything else before we go to the show, sir?
Just that, this is so interesting to me because my daughter's at Oxford working on the era of Queen Elizabeth and James I, and it was so destabilized by religious questions that the recusants were Catholics who wanted to be Catholics but were outlawed by the British law. And so they went underground, and there were priest holes, and there were private masses, and there were Jesuit infiltrators, and there were tortures and hangings and disembowelings, and it damaged the life of Britain. Today, Britain's view is, yeah, we have an Anglican church, which is kind of a state church, but don't take it too seriously, and nobody is persecuted. So the religious chaos that rocked the world between around 1500 and 1800, causing the 30 Years' War, causing enormous violence all over Europe, especially in Northern Europe, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, the hangings and the torturings and the mutilations in Britain. That whole chaos has gone now because the world shrugged and said, it can't be worth disemboweling someone because they don't see the Mass in quite the same way we do. It can't be worth cutting someone's head off because they're skeptical about the Trinity. So it's hard for us to remember how central these questions were and how much damage they did to the peace and security of the European world. Now, for people to want to return in some way to a more religious-centered system, when the diversity is such that we're never going back in that bottle. The Reformation has happened, the Enlightenment has happened, the Great Fissuring has happened. We're never going to have a state church again. For people to want to return to something like an establishment, a presumption that we're a Christian people officially, is just so ahistorical and profoundly misguided that it makes you want to scream. And yet there they are. And Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito are hearkening to all of this, and they're intending to turn back the clock. The conservative forces on the court, and not just the Supreme Court, are intending to turn the clock back to an earlier America, what they regard as sort of Pat Buchanan's America, or Ozzie and Harriet's America, or Leave It to Beaver's America. And if they get away with it, we will be damaged in some very significant ways, and you'll see persecutions that you thought belonged to the Inquisition and not to an advanced industrial democracy like ours. So I know that sounds dire, but I believe it's true. You're going to see school prayer coming into the discourse more and more and more as the goal of Christian nationalists. And of course, there's a racial category that's part of this too. So it is an alarming thing. So let's go to the show, but I want to thank everyone, and I ask everyone who is skeptical of what we've said today to do some reading. Just read about the history of the Establishment Clause. There are lots of great books you can read on this subject, and but also read the Constitution and show me where in the Constitution God, Jesus, or Providence are mentioned. So let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. So good to see you, Mr. Jefferson.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I have a subject of some seriousness that I'd like to discuss with you this week, and It really comes from a letter that you wrote in January of 1802 to the Danbury Baptists. I'm certain you remember this letter, sir.
Yes, I was in the second year of my presidency, just beginning. I often had a New Year's reception at the White House, one of two public receptions per year. But I wrote that day to the Baptists of Danbury in Connecticut, a village in Connecticut, because they had written me to congratulate me on my spirit of freedom of religion, that I was a champion of freedom of religion and had written the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was passed by the Virginia Assembly in 1786. So I had that letter. They had asked me to clarify once again the principles of our republic and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And I wrote back what turns out to be a famous letter, wasn't intended to be, in which I said my reading of the First Amendment is that it erects a wall of separation between church and state.
Well, sir, that letter really was largely forgotten for nearly 150 years, but then in 1947, the Supreme Court, Justice Hugo Black, in his opinion on a case, brought this to the fore, and since that time, that famous phrase of a wall of separation between church and state has become part of the lexicon.
It's interesting to me for several reasons. The phrase wall of separation between church and state is a figurative phrase. In other words, there isn't a literal wall. It's not made of bricks and mortar. So using that metaphor was unusual for me. And the metaphors that I tended to use and similes in my writing were about the ship of state, and you can find innumerable instances of that. The ship has come safely into port, and we've weathered the storm of the Federalists, and so on and so forth. But this was an unusual moment for me, and that signified that this was a moment when I was really stepping back and trying to find precisely the right language for this. The second thing that interests me about this is that it was never intended to be an official document. It was written by the person who happened to be the President of the United States. I was assuring the Baptists of Danbury that as far as I was concerned, they were safe to pursue their religion, which they would not have been had there not been this principle growing in the United States that every person was entitled to worship the God of his choice without civil reward or civil penalty, but that it should in the 20th century, long after my time, have been adopted by the Supreme Court of the United States as a tight paraphrase of the purposes, the principle of the First Amendment, is striking to me. It slightly embarrasses me because I don't want to be the center of attention in that way. But I will say that, as far as I'm concerned, it is the tightest possible paraphrase of the intention of Mr. Madison and the Founding Fathers when they wrote the First Amendment of the Constitution.
So it's fair to say this is something you feel very strongly about, sir.
This is something I feel more strongly about than almost anything else. You know, on my tombstone, the obelisk at Monticello in the cemetery, the graveyard, I said I wanted to be remembered for three things, just three: the Declaration of Independence, the University of Virginia, but at the center, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was, at the time, the most radical statement ever made about separation of church and state. That preceded the letter to the Danbury Baptists by several decades. So, yes, I do feel extremely strongly about this. I believe that when the mind and the conscience are free, all other freedoms are available to us. But when the mind and the conscience are not free, are enslaved by tyranny or priestcraft or superstition or coercion, that the other freedoms of life become less satisfying, in fact, less available to us. And so it all begins with the unlimited freedom of the human mind. If I think there is one moon circulating the earth, or 2 or 20 or 200. That's my own view, and it hurts nobody except myself. If I believe there's one God or 20 or none at all, that neither picks your pocket nor breaks your leg. So what one privately believes is absolutely sovereign. And unless it leads to some sort of antisocial behavior, unless it leads to crime, it must be left unmolested, and by which I mean entirely unmolested by governing bodies at any level. So this for me is something I feel passionate about. And by the way, it was the basis of my friendship with James Madison. Madison and I became dear friends. We were collaborators together for 50 years. He was a near neighbor of mine, and we bonded over our mutual disgust at the monopoly of religion in Virginia. The Anglican Church held a monopoly of religious activity and expression and doctrine until the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which said no, that any other religious entity, any sect, any congregation, no matter what its doctrine, should be allowed to find its adherents, to present itself to the public and see which members of the public sought to attend services under those doctrinal or liturgical conditions. So Madison and I began our long collaboration as crusaders for freedom of religion in Virginia, and therefore I was widely known for this. And by the way, my adversaries said that I was an atheist. They accused me of being a freethinker or an atheist because I was for freedom of religion. That's a pretty large leap, but that's what they did, and I had to combat the charge of being an atheist in one way or another all of my adult life.
Well, knowing this, sir, and you touched on it in your previous statement, but could you perhaps refresh our perspective on this? I mean, my understanding is many people came to America seeking religious freedom.
They did. This, of course, is really about New England. The Puritans and the Pilgrims left Britain because they believed that the Anglican settlement that came beginning with Henry VIII and finally reached its apogee under James I, that the Anglican settlement, that would be the state church of England, and it was not Catholic. It had jettisoned many Catholic rites and doctrines, including purgatory, for example, and it had jettisoned the saints and so on. It was moderate compared to the radical left, but it was an attempt to find a middle way between Roman Catholicism, which had been rejected by the British, and the radical sectarians, the Anabaptists and the Moravians and the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who wanted to purify the church much more thoroughly than the Anglican settlement had permitted. And so, because Anglicanism was regarded by the radical element as too close to Catholicism, it hadn't reformed itself enough, it hadn't cleaned house sufficiently. These people who wanted more purity in the religious system of Britain were called Puritans, and they first left under persecution to go to the Low Countries, to the Netherlands, and from there they came to the New World. The New World had been discovered in 1492, but Raleigh came in 1584, and the Jamestown colony in my own Commonwealth began in 1607. And so this was just at the period when North America was becoming a real thing for the people of Northern Europe, and they decided that they would go to this howling wilderness, because whatever else is true, there they could worship as they pleased. So they did this thing. You know, you've all heard of the Mayflower and Pilgrim Rock and so on. They did this extraordinarily bold and courageous thing of leaving Europe, either England or the Low Countries, and getting in these rickety 17th century ships and crossing this very dangerous ocean for 3,000 miles and landing in New England, which they named, of course, after the home country. And there they felt that they could be free to pursue their religious stringencies without any obstacle. But here's the irony, sir. No sooner had they achieved that freedom, then they began to tyrannize everybody else. They didn't say other groups can come to the New World and worship as they please, or anyone within our own community who has different views is free to worship as he pleases. They created their own religious tyranny, a new monopoly, but in the New World, and were persecuting everybody who didn't conform to their own religious doctrine and their own religious practices. And so they became a problem. They came to the New World in search of freedom, and then they persecuted people who didn't conform to their extremely rigid doctrinal systems and liturgies.
President Jefferson, we need to take a break. When we return, I'd like to talk to you more specifically about what the Constitution says about this.
Well, you know that I was not at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. I was in France at that time, serving as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI, but I watched the process with great curiosity and expectation, and I know that one of my concerns when the product was finished in September of 1787 is that it did not contain a Bill of Rights. So the religious questions that should have been settled in the Constitution were not. And it wasn't until the Bill of Rights was ratified on December 15, 1791, that freedom of religion was finally enshrined in the constitutional structure of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. We shall return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with President Thomas Jefferson about the wall of separation between church and state. And Mr. Jefferson, we touched on the Constitution before we took our break, and it's the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. However, it doesn't prohibit the nation from becoming a Christian nation, does it, sir?
Well, certainly not. The people are free to be anything they want. It could be a Mohammedan nation. It could be a Hindu nation. It could be an atheistic nation. It could be a deist nation. But it is, in fact, demographically and historically, a Christian nation. In other words, the great bulk of the people who came here from Europe were Christians, especially the ones we've spoken about, those who settled New England. Maryland was settled by Catholics. It was the only Catholic province in the New World. Virginia was settled by Anglicans, and we had an Anglican monopoly up until 1786, when my bill for the establishment of religious liberty in Virginia was finally passed, thanks largely to the legislative patience and work of James Madison. Connecticut was Congregationalist, etc. So the Presbyterians had a monopoly in Massachusetts, and each state, for whatever reason, had developed a sort of Christian tribe, Christian approach, monopoly, and they were very hard on people who did not conform to that religious philosophy or that religious system. This seems insane to me, and I first really figured this out by looking at the settlers in Western Virginia. So while I was born an Anglican and raised in the Anglican tradition and knew the Anglican songs and understood the Anglican liturgy and was educated by Anglican tutors, the people in Western Virginia across the Alleghenies, they were Germans, and their religious views were very different, or they were Scots-Irish, and that would make them quite dramatically different from Anglicans. And so here they were, innocent people who came to the New World for all that the New World represents, but they had to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church, whether they were Anabaptists or Moravians or Catholics or what have you. They had to attend religious services, and although these laws were not rigidly enforced, if they failed to attend, they could be fined and eventually much worse. So here were people who were eking out a living on the western side of our mountains who were being taxed for a church they did not support. In fact, a church that they had deliberately left the home countries to get out from under. This seems to me to be exactly what we mean by tyranny. Why should we force people to support a church that they do not, in fact, favor with money and religious attendance? So this is why Madison and I worked so hard on the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which solved that problem. But that was a local thing. Then I looked around and realized that this was the case all over the country. It was just different denominations monopolizing different parts of our colonial system. What we didn't want was a state church in America. England has a state church even into your time, the Anglican Church. Well, it would have been quite possible for the United States to have a state church in my time. Fortunately, there was so much diversity between Pennsylvania and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Maryland and Virginia that it would have been very hard for any one of those churches to become the central, the sole church of the country. But I wanted not to have the situation be merely an accident of diversity. I wanted it to be a principle of our national constitution. And so Mr. Madison wrote the First Amendment, and what he means by establishment would be a state church of the United States, that we mustn't have that either for the country or for any individual state. That's the first half of the religious article in the Bill of Rights in Article 1. The second part is that it must not prohibit the free exercise thereof. So if I am a deist and I want to engage in deistic activities, as long as they are not antisocial, as long as they don't involve crimes, the state cannot notice them. The state must be absolutely neutral, whether I'm a deist or a Hindu or a Jew or a Mohammedan and so on. And so there are two sides to the First Amendment. One, to prohibit once and for all the kind of Anglican official church that exists in England, and secondly, to make sure that there is no persecution of what might be regarded as unusual religious practices or doctrines.
The Constitution says it is against the law to establish a state religion. Am I right?
That is correct. It would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States if, say, South Carolina adopted Methodism as the state religion of South Carolina. That would immediately go to the courts. The courts would strike it down and say that it violates the Establishment Clause of the Constitution of the United States.
A well-written line, sir, that you and Mr. Madison, well, I should say Mr. Madison came up with. It not only prohibits a state religion, but it protects other religions, correct?
That is correct. So something that would be seen as marginal in my time might have been Methodism, which was just beginning to percolate in England. This was not particularly a radical religion, but it was new, and John Wesley was, in some ways, a controversial figure. And so in order to protect that religion, we have the second part of the First Amendment, which says that you cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. And again, I add as a kind of asterisk, as long as it doesn't commit crimes. If there's criminal activity, for example, if there were a church in which, and I speak of horrors here, sir, but if there were a church in which the minister had a doctrine that he would be the person to sleep with every virgin in that church as an act of worship, that would be prohibited under our system because that would be rape. And so, but if he said that, if that same minister said that he should advise every young woman before her marriage, the state would stay clear of that because that would not be the commission of a crime. And so it's only when a crime is intimately involved in the very nature of that church that the state will take notice. But there are many religions which are now mainstream in your time, including Baptists, who would have been persecuted in my time because they were not yet sufficiently rooted in American life to be normalized.
One of the reasons I wanted to speak to you, sir, about this is that, as you know, there are two major political parties in America, and more than 60% of one of those parties want the United States to be declared a Christian nation, according to a recent poll. This is a slippery slope, and as a citizen, it concerns me.
It would be a disastrous occurrence if this were passed into law. If you read the Constitution of the United States, it's about 4,500 words long. The word God is never mentioned. Jesus and Christ are never mentioned. Religion is never mentioned in the body of the Constitution. The Preamble, the famous Preamble, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and so on. That would have been the logical place to invoke providence or God. For example, I invoke providence and the Creator in the Declaration of Independence in these state papers. This is where this sort of thing would occur in that preamble, which was written by Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, but on behalf of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention. God, Godhead, providence, religion, Christ, Jesus, salvation are never mentioned. That means that our Constitution, written in 1787 and ratified in 1788, is a secular document. I repeat, if you just read the Constitution of the United States, you would have to conclude that what they intended was a secular constitutional order in the United States. And then they went one step farther in the Bill of Rights, saying there will be no establishment in a free society, and there will be no prohibition on the free exercise of religious activities by our citizens. It couldn't be any more clear than that. Now, it is true, sir, that demographically, the American people are a Christian nation. If you look at the statistics, well more than half of all Americans say that they believe in God, that they are Christians of one sort or another. They attend religious services, they pray, etc. So this is the distinction that people don't seem to understand. You can be a secular constitutional system inhabited by a Christian people. But it's not just Christians, of course, is it? There are atheists, there are deists, there are Jewish people, there are Muslims, there are people from every religion in every part of the planet, including, of course, Native Americans, who have their own religious systems which bear no resemblance to the Old or New Testaments, and they are all protected in this our happy republic. So the people that in your time who would say we are a Christian nation are absolutely right on average. It's what they intend to do with that statement that's alarming. And if they wish the Constitution to bear witness that we are a Christian nation, that would require a constitutional amendment. It would be a pathetic and an extremely wrong-headed thing to do. I doubt that it could pass because it would effectively disenfranchise or subordinate all Jews, all Muslims, all deists, all atheists, and so on. And that's precisely what the Founding Fathers did not want. In other words, there are many things in your time when you try to figure out what did the Founding Fathers intend that are difficult to make sense of, partly because we lived in a 3-mile-per-hour world that couldn't anticipate the things that matter in your time. And so many times jurists and constitutional theorists have to throw up their hands and say, well, it's not clear. It's not clear what the founders wanted here. It's not clear what they would have intended on this or that situation. But in this one, sir, the Founding Fathers were very clear. If they had wanted us to be a Christian nation by definition, they would have stated it in the Constitution of the United States. That was a blank slate. They could have written anything in those 4,500 words that they chose, and they did not in any time invoke God or Christ or Jesus or salvation or the church. And then they added to it a stronger message in the primary number of the Bill of Rights. So the Founding Fathers were absolutely certain of what they intended here. Does that mean they weren't Christians? Of course not. Most of the Founding Fathers were Christians of one sort or another. but they understood freedom better than the people of your time seem to do, and they knew that to be neutral on these questions was the best possible future for the new Republic of the United States. And so when people in your time get upset about this and say that the founders intended a Christian nation, your answer to them has to be, show me in the primary document of this country where that is ensconced and enshrined.
I have to wonder, sir, the people who advocate this position of becoming a Christian nationalist nation, if they thought it through, what it could mean in the long term. Maybe they believe it's a political advantage for them, but what goes around comes around. And this kind of restriction on religion could spread to other things.
It could, and keep in mind that that's just step one. So let's say that they fashion a constitutional amendment saying the United States of America is a Christian nation under the providential protection of God. If they did that, and it passed, it would take 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of all the states to ratify. So assuming that this statement could be ratified, that's only step one. Now the question is going to be, is Mormonism a Christian religion? What do we do with the Muslims of America now? Should they be openly persecuted? Should they be allowed to worship privately? I mean, these are questions that ravaged the Renaissance, the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I. If you were a Catholic, could you be a church Catholic? In other words, you attend Anglican services, but you quietly practice the Mass at home, maybe bringing in a priest in the middle of the night. What are the penalties for nonconformance? Where does it stop? Are Presbyterians Christians? Are Methodists Christians? Are Unitarians Christians? So once you start down this road, if you're going to say this is a Christian nation, soon you're going to have to define what you mean by Christian, and there are going to be plenty of religious organizations and sects that now have freedom at the margins of the Christian settlement that are going to be under suspicion, are going to be scrutinized by the new censors of religious sensibility. So this system would soon self-divide. This happened in every state. The Anglican Church was a monopoly in Virginia. The Congregational Church was a monopoly in Connecticut. They persecuted people of other faiths. And this is why you don't want to start down this path, because the minute you do, the next step will be, well, such and such a sect doesn't really belong under a Christian dispensation. Let's outlaw it, or let's persecute it in some way. And if you don't believe this is true, just read the history of the 16th and 17th century in England, and you will see what a tragic and anarchic mess it could be.
Finally, Mr. Jefferson, so people understand, it's not as if you prohibited religion, and I mean you allowed religious events to occur at the White House. You sir did not prohibit any religion.
Now we get into my own religious views, which are no one's business but my own, of course. I was very quiet, even secretive about all of that. But as a public matter, for example, Washington, D.C. was our new national capital. There were no churches yet established there. There was almost nothing there when the government moved to the District of Columbia in 1800. John and Abigail Adams were in a White House where the plaster wasn't yet dry, wasn't even on all of the walls in that cavernous building. Pennsylvania Avenue was nothing but mud. Pigs rooted around in what are now public spaces. It was a national capital in potentia for the future. But the point is that there was no place to hold religious services. And so I was asked about this, and I said, well, they can use the House of Representatives on Sunday as long as it's ecumenical. In other words, we can accommodate that. We're not hostile to religion. We just want to make sure there's no establishment, that there's no monopoly, that there's no coercion. And so, yes, it makes good sense. If there were another building, I would suggest that, a private building. But because there isn't, of course, they can hold ecumenical religious services in the on the floor of the House of Representatives. And I attended Anglican services off and on all of my life. My children were baptized and confirmed under the Anglican dispensation. But when other religions came to me asking for donations to build a chapel or a church, I almost always subscribed, even though I didn't particularly have the money to do so. We can be flexible in these things. We don't have to be rigid. The point is, no state church in America and no persecution for you, whatever your religious sensibilities are, however unusual or strange they may seem to the authorities.
Thank you so much for this conversation this week, Mr. Jefferson.
You are welcome, sir.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be speaking with the gentleman who portrays President Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Jefferson. We are now joined by Mr. Clay Jenkinson, out of character. And thank you so much for this conversation this week, sir.
This is a very important subject, one of my favorite subjects in Jefferson. And I should say a couple of things just to get us started. First of all, Dr. James Hudson of the Library of Congress Manuscripts Division is a friend of mine. He's retired now. He's a brilliant scholar. He's written a book on the development of natural rights in European history. He showed me once at the Library of Congress the actual document, the letter to the Danbury Baptists.
Really?
Yeah, so there it is. And, of course, in Jefferson's just exquisite handwriting. And they had a super-duper 3D printer, I hope that's a technical term, in which they had been able, David, you'll understand this, it had been able to go behind the letters. It could penetrate over the ink into what was behind the ink on this page. And what it found was that what Jefferson had originally written was a wall of eternal separation between church and state. So he had added a strong adverb, like, I really mean this. And so, but had crossed it out and left it as wall of separation between church and state. So there it was, and you can see unmistakably that he had carried it in eternal, but for one reason or another, thought better of it. So that's amazing. So in other words, it's not a throwaway sentence. It's something that Jefferson deeply believed. And in the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which was passed in 1786 while he was in France, he added this thing at the bottom of the Preamble. The Preamble is this magnificent statement of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. At the end of it, he says, and I know that no law can be perpetual. I get it, that people coming along 20 or 30 years from now can write different laws or rescind this one. But they shouldn't. He says they shouldn't. You should never mess with this. You should never deteriorate this principle that I have articulated in the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. So he knows that he's on thin ice here, because you can't, he believes the world belongs to the living and future generations have absolute sovereignty over how they wish to live their lives. But he can't help himself and says, I've written this, don't ever rescind this. You mustn't ever rescind this. So nothing was more important to Jefferson than this. And so, as you say, Hugo Black and the courts of the mid-20th century began to use that phrase, wall of separation, as a really good paraphrase of the intentions of the First Amendment, until William Rehnquist came along. Rehnquist was in the 70s, a conservative retreat from the courts led by Earl Warren that desegregated schools and outlawed prayer in schools and so on. And Rehnquist went after Jefferson and said, Jefferson was just a man. He was just a president. He was not a jurist. He wasn't a Supreme Court justice. This wasn't a filing before the Supreme Court. That's a private letter. We shouldn't be making as much of his phrase wall of separation as we seem to do. Why are we all hanging on Jefferson here? Because this is unrelated, really, as legal doctrine. It was snarky, but he was right. he was right that phrase is not a constitutional phrase, and therefore it may not, the First Amendment it has more nuances in it than we're giving it credit for having.
I thought Jefferson did a very good job explaining that.
Yes, he did. So anyway, now we're in this position where, all my life, I've been at this for 40 years, and almost every time I ever go somewhere, somebody comes up and says, "So Jefferson was a Christian?" And I say, "Well, not really. He was mostly a Unitarian." And then they say, "And the Founding Fathers intended a Christian nation." And then I say, "Well, if that were so, it should be in the document." When they hear me say that the Constitution is utterly free of any reference to God, then they say, "That's because it was so obvious that it didn't even need to be stated. It was so clear and obvious. They didn't have to say something like that." So the arguments are really thin and weak, but it is very striking to me that when the Constitution was written, largely by Christians in 1787, that they did not put in the kind of routine language of God and providence, because the Declaration of Independence, speaks of the laws of the Creator. Providence is invoked at the end. In a document like this, you would expect there to be an invocation of divine providence of some sort. If it's an Enlightenment invocation, it would be very general and vague, but it could have been much tighter. It could have said, "Under the auspices of God who helped us achieve independence from Great Britain, and knowing of the sacrifice of his Son for all humankind, we now establish this Constitution." They did not. It's a purely secular document, and it's so hard for people to get that into their brains that it doesn't mean we're an atheist nation or even a secular nation. It means we have a secular constitution. And I regard the Constitution as one of the Enlightenment's greatest single achievements. And the Enlightenment was beginning to edge away from a Christian-centered or a religious-centered view of the universe into a more scientific, a more admittedly secular outlook. And so it reflects that time. If the Constitution had come later, after the Second Great Awakening, it probably would have invoked providence or God. But it happened in 1787 at the high water mark of the Enlightenment in America, and therefore reflects that intense, purposeful secularity. And so the people that are wanting us to be a Christian nation are making many confusions. They're confusing demographics with the Constitution, but they also are not speaking with historical grounding. If they would just read the literature, any history of this era, they would say, "Okay, we get it. We get it that the Founding Fathers lived in this secular time, and this was Enlightenment, and so on. But we would now like to declare that this is a Christian nation because we think that's so important to our national order or decency or whatever." That would be an argument worth making, and we'll see if it passes.
I get very alarmed when I read news reports about politicians saying that we should become a Christian nationalist Christian nation. But on the other hand, I think it is political posing in order to gain support. I can't imagine this ever happening.
Yeah, we couldn't imagine the reverse of Roe either. Things do happen, and this is a very unprecedented time. I have to say I blame someone like Ronald Reagan on this front. Remember what he used to say? Who expelled God from the classroom? A kind of an easy, sleazy, snarky statement like that's very memorable and very clever is fundamentally ahistorical, because it suggests that a bunch of angry atheists have expelled God from the classroom to get even or to do damage to the United States, when in fact the Supreme Court agonized over this through the 20th century until finally they said, the First Amendment seems to prohibit prayer in schools, because that would be an establishment of Christianity, and some of those students might be Muslims, some of those students might be Jews, some of those students might be Lakota Indians. And so the Supreme Court didn't do this joyfully or with willful destructiveness. They agonized over the meaning of the First Amendment, and when these cases came about prayer at baccalaureate or prayer on the football field or prayer in school and so on, they had to say, what did the founders really intend here? And what it amounts to is, when in doubt, you can't have it. So when in doubt, if there's a list of the 10 Commandments on the courthouse lawn and somebody files suit, the courts have to say, nope, that would be an establishment. That would suggest that in this county in Alabama or this county in Wyoming, that the Old Testament, the Christian dispensation, is the established religion. What about the Quran? What about the Bhagavad Gita? What about the Upanishads of India? And when someone files suit about a crucifix on the publicly held mountain, publicly owned mountain overlooking a Colorado town, the courts say, I'm sorry, that now that you brought it up, we wouldn't have proactively gone after it, but now that you brought it up, yes, that crucifix probably has to come down. The same is true of the creche on the courthouse lawn. And so the courts aren't doing this because they're nasty. The courts are doing this because they're trying to adhere to the intentions of the Constitution of the United States and the First Amendment. And the people that hate that, and we all know the people who hate that, then they think, well, they're attacking religion. But of course they're not attacking religion. They're adhering to the compact. And the same people are absolutists on the Second Amendment, but they are willing to play fast and loose with the First, because they're not consistent in their constitutional reading, or I almost said constitutional philosophy, but it's not philosophy. It's just concern. So here's my question to anyone. There are people listening who probably disagree with some of this. They can't disagree historically, but they can disagree about intention. So if they disagree, I would ask them this. What if we started Christian prayer in every school in America tomorrow? That starting tomorrow, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 12th grade, you go to school, and the principal gets on, and there's a Christian prayer. How will that change America in the next 20, 50, or 100 years? In other words, that cat, David, is out of the bag. We are so secular. In fact, I'll go to the other end of the spectrum here. As a humanities scholar who agonizes every day over what's happened to America, I am deeply worried about the radical secularization of American life. I think our secularity enables all sorts of chaos and abuse and exploitation of the environment and a despiritualization of landscapes, including in my beloved North Dakota. That radical secularity is the characteristic of the American people in the 21st century, and it's killing us, and it's killing the planet. That we need to re-spiritualize, but not along the lines necessarily of the Old and New Testament. So I'm worried about secularity, but I also know that the founders had it right when they created this wall of separation. And so people just need to calm down and to do some hard historical reading.
Good luck with that.
It's just, it's just so wearying.
It's not the era of calming down, I don't think.
But you suggested this program. You're alarmed by this phenomenon.
Well, I am, I am, but I also, it's always very reassuring to hear the voice of Thomas Jefferson and get his perspective and slow down and think about it and what it means. I mean, for me, it comes down to, what is America? It's freedom for all or freedom for none. And once you take away religious freedom for all, what you just explained, the dangers of what could happen, I think, are the things to consider.
Well, certainly. And, this is a very imperfect history that we've had. The LDS Church was persecuted desperately in the 19th century. It's what finally led Brigham Young to take them to Deseret, to Utah. So it takes vigilance to make sure that we realize this, and I know this bothers the Christian nationalists, but in this country, from a religious point of view, anything goes as long as crimes are not committed. And so when David Koresh is using his primacy in his offbeat sect to mass illegal guns and to rape women in his church, the U.S. government eventually stepped in. Why? Not because he has a wacky doctrine, or understanding of religion, but because he was committing crimes that are actual crimes in the codes of the United States government. And so there's a breadth. If you drive to the edge of Denver, to the edge of Charlotte, North Carolina, to the edge of Charlottesville, you see all these teeny little churches in strip malls they just open one day, and there are folding chairs in it, and they splurge and get a $150 cross, and then a few years later they have a splendid new temple on the edge of town. It's just breathtaking to watch how the spin-off, it all began in the Reformation. It was Catholicism until Luther and Calvin, and then the fissuring began, and the fissuring is fissured and fissured and fissured and fissured until now. If you look in the yellow pages, or what used to be the yellow pages of a city, you'll see this breathtaking variety of religious expression, all the way from conservative Roman Catholicism to a more liberated Roman Catholicism, from high Anglicanism to Episcopalianism, and everything down the line until you get to the edge of town. And right next to the Napa Auto Parts store, there's a tiny little new religious entity that some guy has opened, and people start to come, and if he can appeal to them for whatever appeals to them, he builds a church. And if he can't, in the free marketplace of religious ideas, they drift back to baptism or Methodism or Lutheranism or whatever it might be. It's astounding, and no other country has this. This is one of the great geniuses of our system. And I just love it, because it doesn't pick your pocket, David. It doesn't break your leg. That's Jefferson's famous statement from Notes on the State of Virginia. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And when you think about it, it's true. I mean, they may be wacky, they may be insane, but as long as they're driving at the speed limit and not shooting people in the streets, they're protected. And the market will decide. I mean, if I open a church tomorrow, I've thought of it, actually. I've thought of it. If I opened a little church, the Church of Humanism, on the edge of town, it would close within 6 months. But if I were a charismatic and had a view of salvation, that Jesus was actually a woman, or Jesus was dropping acid, or Jesus had gone to China and had learned some Confucianism, and all these, by the way, are religions, I might find some adherents, and they might support me. And I say, have at it. That's it. The result is fissuring, but the alternative is tyranny, and people don't seem to understand that.
Thank you very much, Clay, for this enlightening discussion. Is there anything we ought to worry about?
Yes, there is. I believe that if the current trends continue, David, the 1960s cases at the Supreme Court that outlawed prayer in school will be overturned. We already see the case that in the last session in which the coach in Washington State is now allowed to pray with his students on the 50-yard line before, during, or after the game. I believe that there will be an erosion and maybe a demolition of the wall of separation between church and state, and that we will move to an America that is much less free. And we won't know that we lost our freedom until we lost it, and then people will say, how did this happen? We must be vigilant. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.